although this day was supposed to be dry, it turned out to be quite wet at first thing in the morning, so you can see the track's pretty wet, and this is my first time out on the track in the wet on semi-slick tyres, so I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd been told that the tyres didn't perform well in the wet, so I was going very slowly. Also, actually, I should explain, I didn't do my sighting laps. This Ginetta was going round at a heck of a speed, even in the wet, but I digress. So I didn't do my sighting laps, and so the marshals said do 3 steady laps and then come back in. So this is when I first went out. This is the worst of it, actually. This was when the weather was at its worst. Gradually through the day it dried out, and my times gradually started to improve. I'm not going to bore you with all of the slow, wet laps. I think we should move on and start to look at some of the other stuff. This is immediately after lunch. Now, I'm sure you know, as the tyres heat up, the pressures go up, so you have to keep letting the tyre pressures down again to restore it back to 30 psi is what I run. And then over the lunch break they dropped by about 6 degrees down to 24. Now what I could do is reinflate them, go through the whole warm-up procedure, and then gradually drop the pressures, but what I decided was I'd do 3 steady laps to get the tyres up to temperature, and then start to push on a bit. So you can see that the track is still damp in places, and yeah, just there on the outside of Clearways, for example, that was damp, and the outside of Paddock was damp actually, which is a bit unnerving, because if you miss your if you run wide, miss your apex, then you're going to run onto the wet, and it's probably going to give you a problem. Let's have a look how it looks. Yeah, so it's a bit damp on the left, but gradually drying out. And you can see now I'm doing more reasonable times, 1:04.87 on that previous lap. So I kept improving lap by lap. I think the next one was 1:03. So quite happy with this actually. The car's going great, really is. Some of the things I should explain to you about the dash readout, you can read and see on the left hand side. You can see it says gear number. Now there is no gear detector on the car. It doesn't actually register which gear you're in. And so the way it's done is the AIM logger calculates the gears based on RPM and GPS speed, and that's how it knows I'm in 4th gear now, coming down here. But one thing you do find is occasionally it does crazy things, like you'll see it says 5th suddenly, then it immediately jumps back to 3rd. It's just when you're changing down or blipping the throttle or something, it seems to upset it a bit. But other than that, it's pretty good. It's a lot better than not having anything there. You saw it went into neutral there, apparently. So that's one thing. The brake indicator doesn't work because I've got no brake pressure measurement on the car, so you won't get that. What else? The G. Actually, I seem to have put the wrong G meter on there, where it's showing the little red ball moving from left to right. So what I'm trying to look at is the grip circle here, but I did have the numbers, lateral and longitudinal G values, but for some reason I must have loaded up the wrong overlay here, and it's not showing those numbers. But everything else was working fine. Obviously you can see the camera's working fine, and I think the position's about right. But one of the things I found with going round was repeatedly over and over again I was improving on my time, and then obviously this is just a track day and people are, actually I'm not really taking much notice of the time anyway. You're not supposed to measure the times, and I didn't. I looked at the times after, you know, as they got logged onto the overlay in the video. But what I did find was when I was doing fast laps, people would overtake me down the insides, such as coming into Surtees here, like that, and then they'd slow suddenly, and that meant that I couldn't. I had to slow right up, and so it's quite difficult. You can't really do fast times on track days. You might get lucky, but yeah, it's quite difficult because you've got such a mix of cars. You've got road cars that go faster than you down the straights, but then they're very slow through the corners. See, he's braked much earlier than I did. I would have braked. I would brake much later than where he was braking, and yet, you know, he's in a much more powerful car, so it's much faster. So there are those sorts of challenges on a track day. So this turned out to be the sort of coming into what was my fastest lap. Now this is quite interesting. I'd just come out of the pits again, came around here. I was feeling that it was understeering. You see, it went quite wide, and it was because I'd still got the traction control on. It's really strange in these cars that you get understeer when the traction control kicks in. You'd think you'd get oversteer because the weight would transfer to the front, but that's not what happens. It's certainly not in this car or in the car I've been driving all year. Both of them I found the same, and it's really noticeable around clearways actually, here at Brands Hatch. But anyway, this, you can see I've got a good run here. It's quite clear. Car up ahead, which will come into play eventually, but luckily it stayed far away enough from me to give me a clear run. This all looks good. I was trying to make sure I came round Surtees here flat and try to get up onto the curb, but I didn't do it there. You can see I missed the curb. People I've been racing with told me, some of the more experienced ones tell me that they try and skim the first layer of the curb. So the curb's in two layers. There's a lower step and then there's an upper step. And the idea is you try and skim across the lower one. Okay, so that was my fastest time, 1:02.59. So just to go back to Surtees briefly, the reason you skim across it, you try and skim across it, is because if you just clip the curb, unfortunately there's a bump at the end of the curb, and as you go across it, it makes the back of the car slightly step out, and if you're really pushing it, you can feel it, and it upsets the car a bit. So it seems that what everybody does is they try and skim across the top of the curb. I don't think I've quite perfected it yet, but that's something to concentrate on next time I get an opportunity. Anyway, we had a great day. It was really good. The rain held off in the end, and very enjoyable session, and the car performed perfectly.